From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis. You know, of all the stories we've discussed here on this program, I think it's fair to say that none has affected me as deeply and made me angrier than what we're going to talk about today. It's not one story at all. It's a suite of municipal policies that have evolved over many years that amount to an all-out fiscal assault on the least wealthy residents of our city. ProPublica's Melissa Sanchez was among the earliest to report on it. Elliot Ramos and WBEZ joined in later. A number of other outlets like the Chicago Reporter and the Reader have been a part of it. And years ago, the Tribune really kind of led the way with their reports that we talked about here on the show. The reports on the effect that red light and speeding camera tickets were having in poorer communities. The numbers, ladies and gentlemen, are staggering. And we'll get into this in more detail here today. But essentially, it works like this. You have to pay perhaps $100 for a city sticker, depending on the kind of car you have. You don't really have it. So you decide to use what money you have on food for the kids, maybe ComEd, let the sticker slide for a month or so if you can be lucky. And within hours of the deadline, there's a $200 ticket on your car. You can't pay that either. It increases to $400. In no time, the car is booted. Maybe within a couple of weeks, it's in the auto pound. Now your fines are into the $1,000 range. That car was your lifeline to work and the way you got your kids around the neighborhood and the city. And that we know can be challenging enough just because of the street violence you live with every day. The city sells your car for $100 to a politically connected private contractor who crushes it and sends you the bill for crushing it. And within a couple of months, that $100 sticker you didn't buy has landed you so deep in debt that your only option might be declaring bankruptcy. This is how Chicago treats its most under-resourced citizens. It was back in early March that I attended a symposium on this crazy mess and heard presentations from the two professors you're about to meet. I immediately wanted to get them on Chicago Newsroom, but it wasn't easy because they're both in great demand. But we got them today, so buckle in. I'm referring to Mary Patillo, Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Northwestern University. Professor, welcome.
Thank you.
And also Stacey Sutton, Assistant Professor of Urban Planning and Policy at UIC. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
So happy to have you here today to continue this discussion. Let me ask you this. Do you think that I'm far off by identifying this intersection of municipal policy and poverty as being in collision with one another and municipal policy is winning?
No, you're not far off, and you actually perhaps explain what happens in some degree, because you left off at the point in which the city sends residents the bill for crushing the car, and then they file Chapter 13 bankruptcy. But what we forgot to say is that that doesn't solve the debt. They still owe the city the money, right? So Chapter 13 does not pay off the debt, but it allows them to perhaps keep their job because of the anti-scoff laws, which would say they couldn't, or keep their license and so forth. So it gets worse.
And Mary Patillo,
well, can I just add how it gets worse is you're focusing on the city story, which is super important, but there are many more layers up to the state level. So my own research is not actually on the municipal laws, but on the state level laws. So in the criminal justice system, in the criminal courts, for felonies, misdemeanors, which include your DUIs and other kinds of traffic violations that make it to state court. So above the speeding red light tickets, but up to including like DUIs, driving without insurance, those kinds of things. The state law then also has fines and fees. So the fines are supposedly the punitive part, and the fees, which I can talk about in more detail a little later, supposedly reimburse the system for its costs. So you are sentenced to those along with, depending on how serious your offense is, you might get probation, you might get jail time. If you get prison time, when you come out, then you still have these fines and costs to pay.
I'm jumping all around here because I get a little emotional about this, but one of the things that really ticks me off about this is that it's not really, it's kind of, I don't know what, there's a legal term I'm sure, but it's kind of quasi-judicial. I mean, you're dealing with these privatized hearing officers, right, who are not officers of any court. So the whole thing to me just feels like it just kind of exists just slightly outside of the Constitution. I don't know.
Well, again, the part that I study, which is the state part, it's not quasi-judicial, it is 100% judicial. It happens in the courts. Illinois has a unified court system, so every county has a court that's part of the circuit court system. And these are real judges, elected judges, who oftentimes spend a lot of their day, people who are coming back, say, every 3 months, and the judge is there asking, so how much are you paying today? You're paying $20, go to the clerk's office, bring your receipt back. Spending a lot of time just monitoring these payments that are part of the sentence.
And I think within the city, if we think about it within any municipality, it's part of it's not just Chicago, right? It's part of a broader kind of neoliberal kind of governance structure in which cities are trying.
Neoliberal governance structure.
I know,
I'm going to write that one down.
Well, it's the privatization of everything, as you say, right? It's the privatization of other public services, and it's hard to disaggregate like what part is fully public and what part is private. But cities are often, they argue that they're strapped for funds, and so they sell, whether they're selling their parking meters or they're contracting out, it becomes a punitive process by which they're extracting more revenue from those. They're extracting revenue from everyone, but the punitive, it's particularly punitive because those who have less and who are unable to pay, it becomes a regressive tax they really can't pay.
That's where I think we kind of have to slow it down a little bit, because many people will say, well, you ran a red light, or you were driving drunk, or you robbed a store, or all the way up to you assaulted someone. So again, we're going from the municipal part, these red light tickets, all the way up to felonies, which are different jurisdictions. But many people will say, you did something wrong, and there is a penalty for that.
The ProPublica website was pretty much assaulted when they started doing these reports with people saying, here's an idea, why don't you just buy your city sticker?
Exactly.
Here's an idea, why don't you park, normally?
But that's why it's important to unpack what Stacey just said about it being a regressive tax. What does that mean? It means that if you are fined $500 and your monthly income is $1,000, that's a huge proportion of what you make. If you're fined $500 and your monthly income is $10,000, which is well within what many people's incomes are, then that's nothing. So a regressive tax is something that's supposedly applied equally, and thus it is just, but it has much different impacts on people of different economic needs.
That is such an important point, and I'm a case in point. 2 years ago, I just completely spaced it. I didn't get my sticker, and I am not exaggerating. On the first morning, I walked out and there's a ticket on my car, right? Now, in my case, two things. First of all, I realized it was my own just stupid fault. I didn't have to make these crucial decisions about I'm going to try to hide my car. No, I just made a stupid mistake. And I had the wherewithal to pay the ticket. So I was grumpy about it, but I paid the ticket. That is a completely different world than the world we're talking about here, where people are making life and death decisions and saying, this is, as you say, this is a measurable percentage of my income. I can't do it.
Can't do it. Yep. Yeah. I think that's really important to remember. And I mean, I think we'll get into this, but it's not just that we all make bad decisions and thus we all kind of suffer the consequences. As Mary said, it's disproportionate for poor people, but then we have to look at kind of the racial patterns that emerge. It's both poverty and race, and the intersection of poverty and race as it plays out in the city in terms of where ticketing is happening disproportionately or where cameras may be. I mean, that adds another kind of egregious level to it.
Actually, let's detour onto that, because you just fired off another neuron in my brain. I remember you talking about this at the symposium. You put up maps. I'd completely forgotten about this, but you put up maps of the city, and I'm sorry, I don't remember if I think it was you, Stacey, right? Mm-hmm. A map of the city with all the red light cameras, and you look at it and you say, well, these red light cameras are fairly well distributed across the city until
you unpack. So let me just back up. So it's both red light and speeding cameras, right? And initially, I was struck by the idea that we're seeing some kind of racialized pattern that looks very much like the city in terms of the north, south, west divide of the city. And it didn't make sense because it's not racial profiling purportedly, it's not the bias of police that we know a lot about, but why would we see these patterns? Yeah? And so when I started to dig a little deeper, what you realize is, okay, well, the cameras actually, on kind of descriptively, they look like they're dispersed across the city fairly evenly. There's a little bit more concentration up north even. But then you realize, okay, well, let's do some kind of buffer around each camera. Like, look at, you can't fully kind of estimate, but look at travel patterns. Look at where people may be moving and the degree to which people stay within their neighborhoods or they move outside of their neighborhoods in terms of travel. And so when you do a 3-mile buffer around the neighborhood, or you use some other statistical techniques that allow you to look at both the driver's neighborhood and then their nearest neighbors, there's a disproportionate number of cameras in that when you calculate it that way. So what that's saying is, because of racial segregation and the fact that the black population is disproportionately concentrated in the South and black and Latino in the West, and those happen to be the neighborhoods that people are kind of traversing day to day, they come in contact with more cameras, and they get more tickets.
And there it is.
And there it is.
And there's that intersection again of race and poverty and municipal policy.
And I will just say, so there's also evidence that that same kind of pattern exists for where Chicago PD, the Chicago Police Department sets up their DUI kind of stings, not where you find the most, for example, drunk driving, traffic accidents or anything along those lines, but disproportionately also in black and Hispanic
There are so many of these aspects that appear on paper and on a map to be fairly, equally distributed until you get into the details. One of the things that I find really interesting is that the tickets mostly on the south side, or no, I guess on the west side, are written more by police officers than by meter maids or whatever you want to call them. There are privatized. I didn't even realize there were privatized people going around writing tickets for us too. But there's a reason for that too, right? There's a reason why police officers write more tickets in certain communities. Is that right?
Quite honestly, I haven't fully studied, but I think there is a reason. I mean, we could say that these neighborhoods are more surveilled. There are more police present.
There's just more police officers
and so
there.
They're there when any kind of infraction may happen, and so it's more common for them to do that. Where the privatized ticket agency tend to be correlated with the parking meters and the selling of the parking meters, and so they tend to be in areas where you see more of those, and in the loop area and so forth.
And I was interested to see that there is a disparity in the other direction, that it's not mostly, but certainly more predominant in the white community to be getting parking tickets. And that, I guess, is partly because there's just more parking going on and more, more parking meters and everything else.
Much greater density.
Much greater density,
density is much higher.
So but again, these are situations where the parking meter violation might be $40 or something, right? So for most of the people who are parking outside a trendy restaurant, a $40 ticket it's just like another, it's just something you add to the bill for the going out for the night, right?
So the racial component is super important, and definitely I think in Chicago there's lots of evidence about how important it is. I've been doing research across the state, and I know we're talking about Chicago, but it's important
we're talking about it all.
To put Chicago in context. And so there, I think, again, the poverty story is the more highlighted, because when you go to more rural areas of the state, really, and there's a lot more white poor people, which there are fewer of here in Chicago, but you see how salient poverty is as the thing that keeps people ensnared in the criminal justice system.
Right,
and by ensnared, again, I can hear the critics saying, well, you just shouldn't have broken the law. You ensnared yourself in the criminal justice system. But I want to be clear about what I mean by that. What I mean is, again, a $500 fine and costs and fees is going to be a different thing for two different people. So the wealthy person's going to pay it online. never have to go to court and be done with it. The person, or if they go to court and they get probation for whatever, either a traffic violation or some other misdemeanor, then they're on probation, but they've paid their fine, and when their probation is done, they're done. The person who can't pay the $500 might spend 6 months on probation. The probation's supposed to be done when they're after the 6 months, but they can't pay their fine. They get their probation extended. So this is what I mean by ensnared. The judge will give them more time to pay. They try to come up with a payment plan. They could be on probation for another 12 months, 18 months. And because you're still on probation, any new infraction now is going to have double the consequences, whereas if this other person who has already paid, their new infraction is just not at all related to the former one. So this, just because of the inability to pay, two people who committed the same crime are getting unequal punishments.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That really is interesting, yeah. And we're also talking about, I was kind of backing into this before, but I'm forgetting what I was about to ask you because there's so many things I want to spill out
so
here.
much to talk about.
But anyway, just completely changing topics. I just learned this morning that the Institute for Justice has filed suit against the city of Chicago to end the impoundment program. That's what they're seeking to do. And they're saying that in their suit, they're saying that 22,000 tows were done by Chicago in 2017 alone, just in the 1 year. 22,000 people had their cars towed. And this is not part of the impoundment program that the police department has for like drug infractions and everything. This is just for the minor stuff. And of those, 8,300 of the cars were sold just in 2017 alone.
Well, you know, this is, again, I mean, there's so much important attention on this. And partially it's from the grassroots up, and it's also up down. So what do I mean by that? I mean from the grassroots up, the Cabrini Green Legal Aid Society, Chicago Appleseed Fund for Justice, the Shriver Center, many of those advocacy organizations have been doing reports on all of these kinds of things that have gotten the attention of the legislature and of the Supreme Court here in Illinois. But also at the Supreme Court of the United States level, there was a recent decision in February. It's called Timms versus Indiana. The case, our neighboring state here in Indiana, a man was arrested for selling drugs. It was actually a sting operation. He was arrested for selling drugs.
This is the same outfit that's suing in Illinois. It's the Institute for Justice.
Right.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
They were his his representation in the Supreme Court. So the police in that local jurisdiction impounded his car, which was a $42,000 Land Rover, I think, that he had used insurance money to buy. It wasn't he had just gotten into drug selling. He had never sold drugs before and was a drug addict, in fact, and is now clean. But the long story short, they impounded his $42,000 car, and then through civil forfeiture laws, basically took it for his crime, even though the maximum fine for what he was doing was $10,000. So initially, every lower court in Indiana said, no, you can't take his $42,000 car. And then the Supreme Court of Indiana said, oh, yes, you can, because the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, which bars excessive fines and fees, doesn't apply to the states. That's a U.S. Constitution and doesn't apply to the states. So that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court finally said, hundreds of years after the signing of the Constitution, no, this 8th Amendment actually applies to you in the states. But this is a huge deal because what you're talking about, this taking of property when people are pulled over for suspicion of drugs or any other kind of crime, this taking of property and using that property for the enrichment of the municipality or the police department is something that's happening all over the country.
And it seems to be expanding because it's a great source of
Yes,
finance,
it's a great source of
which
revenue.
leads me to the thing that I was trying to remember
great,
just
you're
now,
right.
which is that for the city of Chicago, this is not a small deal. we've talked many times on the show here about the fact that almost all of our property tax money and most of the taxes we pay really end up just kind of paying off pensions and debt, basically. That's what they do. So the city has to look other places to find the money to pick up the garbage and install water mains and everything else. And 7% of the operating budget of the city of Chicago last year came from these tickets.
Absolutely.
7%.
That's right. It's huge. It's a huge revenue stream. So when I said, I used the term neoliberal governance, it's both the privatization of things that used to be public services, but it's also the way in which cities are purportedly strapped for funds and are looking for new revenue streams.
Right.
And this becomes a kind of, in a city's mind, an easy way to collect revenue. And although a lot of people don't pay, the reality is that they can still make 7% of their budget from people that pay.
The ones that do.
Yeah.
There was a very interesting piece, or a part of the original I think ProPublica story about the role that Susana Mendoza played as city clerk, because she was the city clerk when Rahm Emanuel became mayor, or they were elected, I think, at the same time. And Rahm Emanuel said, I need to increase the fees for city stickers. And she fought him on it. It was a very public battle. And then they came to this agreement that instead of raising the price for city stickers, you just raise the fines on people who don't pay them. And the argument is, let's go after the scofflaws. That was the term, right? So the concept that she had was that the city would be able to raise $16 million in fines from scofflaws, and it turned out that I don't think they ever even raised $1 million. Nothing ever came of it, because, and I don't know exactly what, I know I have it somewhere in here, but something like 2/3 of the tickets that are given to Chicagoans for not having a sticker never get paid.
Right.
And it's for this reason. They couldn't afford to buy the sticker in the first place. They can't afford to pay your triple and double fines.
Yeah.
That's right.
So, moving away from the regressive regime that Stacey mentioned would be perhaps a progressive or a graduated amount for the city sticker.
Yeah.
And if the city doesn't want to get in the business of asking us our incomes, for example, although they very well could, but they could peg it to the value of the car or the age of the car or something along those lines, which is again an indication. If you have a Tesla, you're likely to be able to afford the $100 city sticker. If you have a 20-year-old Dodge, I don't know, something, then you're maybe not. So that's one way to think about.
The city, certainly the county already asks us for our income because you can get a reduction on your property taxes from it. So this mechanism already exists, but you wouldn't make as much money if you did that.
Well, no, because you could raise the price of the city sticker for the Tesla owners,
that's right,
and lower the price of the city sticker for the 20-year-old Dodge owners.
Communist. But yes, that is the issue that we're confronting here, is this idea that you can get your car taken for what's happening is, as they're raising the prices, they're also lowering the threshold for where they can take your property. And now in Chicago, you can lose your car if a police officer stops you and decides that you are playing your music too loud, right? There have been
that's a crime, and then they
that's
can
a crime,
impound the car.
and they can impound your car.
Right. I do think, though, again, with this Supreme Court ruling in Timms versus Indiana, not that our local police departments are like, oh, the Supreme Court ruled. I'm not saying that it happens that way, but I think there are more lawyers who are likely keeping their eyes on, because the fine for playing your music too loud, which is likely a disorderly or disturbing the peace infraction, would be quite low. And to take a $15,000 car, something valued at $15,000 for playing your music too loud, I think would be more difficult in this climate, I hope, but crazier things have happened. And I'm also just amazed. So, for example, it is illegal to imprison someone for not paying their fines and fees. We've outlawed debtors' prisons in the 1980s. Bearden versus Georgia is the U.S. Supreme Court ruling. but across the country, we routinely jail people for not being able to pay their fines and fees.
Well, this is part of the Institute for Justice suit. In their claim, they call it Chicago's Impound Racket. That's what they name it, and they say that it violates the Constitution of the United States of America because it requires vehicle owners to pay administrative penalties prior to any final judgment and holds the vehicles until all payments are made. So, you know, an argument could be made that this is a violation of the Constitution, and that's what they're going to try to do, I guess.
Yeah.
So I wonder if we could expand this conversation out a little bit. One of the things that is not really totally related to this, but I've wanted to talk to both of you about, is the ability of, let's call them just white people versus, let's just call them minorities, to build wealth. That there is a kind of an inherent bias against, it works out to be a bias against people of color to be able just simply to build wealth from the beginning. You know, Ta-Nehisi Coates, these kinds of, this kind of thing. And it's something that I think has just bothered me forever, this idea that in the 1960s, when I was a kid, my parents were new immigrants. They had very little money. They didn't own anything, but they were able to end up buying a house for $17,000 in 1967, which they then passed on to me, and it was worth $95,000 when I sold it. And I got wealth from them. And I was able to buy my own house and all that. So that I got this kickstart, even though my parents at some point had no money at all. The black family a few miles away was redlined from the beginning. And so they never had that access even to that $17,000 house. And if they did, they didn't have the methods for keeping it that my parents did.
Absolutely. I think
that.
I think it's important to unpack what you mean by redlining, because I think it's a common term that we use quite often, but I don't think everyone understands that, right? And it was both legal and it was part of the social norms in terms of the lending practices, where bankers would take risks, right? And it just so happened that in black neighborhoods, they were considered high risk. Thus, they were circled on the maps as red, and they were excluded from lending. So that means that people could not get formal mortgages, they couldn't get home equity loans to improve their home, and so forth. Where in the white communities, they were able to get access to that capital, right? So we know that there's a vicious cycle that happens with that. So once you have to, so it wasn't that black people weren't getting homes. They were getting them, but there were usury rates. They were getting them, and with different stipulations, such that if they didn't make one payment, they could lose their home, right? So it was extremely vulnerable. So as you said, they were not able to accumulate wealth in their home in the same way that white families were able to do. And therefore, and so when we take it to a contemporary moment, we see the same thing, or something quite similar when we look at the housing crisis of 2007 and 8, right? In that we see a racial pattern in terms of where the predatory lending was happening. And so historically, we've understood that home ownership was a primary way in which Americans could generate wealth by, investing in their home and then passing that wealth forward. But black families ended up investing in debt, right? And you lose your home.
Investing in debt.
You invest in debt, right? And
kind
then
of like
you
what the
pass that
city is
forward.
doing right now.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. The city is like a black family in the 50s. It's just
well, you know what? That is the irony, that both the state government and the city government have a disdainful tone towards folks who can't pay their fines and fees because they don't have the money.
Right.
Yet the city and the state are in the same fiscal crisis. And in the research that I do, where I look at the state debates when they've put forth new laws that add interest if you don't pay on time and penalties if you don't pay on time, the legislators will say, well, we don't have the money to fund the courts, So we should fund the courts, but we don't have the money to fund the courts, and so we need this extra revenue. And they're saying exactly, unfortunately, what individuals are saying. I should have money to pay this ticket, but I don't because I need to buy food.
There's a weird,
it's crazy.
a kind of an uncanny parallel to like the 80s and the 90s, when we thought the simple solution to the drug problem was just increasing prison time and increasing the penalties, and that way we'll get the drug kingpins and all that. And what we ended up doing was incarcerating, you know, 1 million people that didn't need to be incarcerated, at least not for the length of time. And now we're paying that bill in society too, because as these people begin to come out of prison, they've been in for the 20 most productive years of their lives, and they're standing there saying, well, where are the jobs? What am I supposed to do?
That's right.
Right.
You mentioned that 16 communities that are majority black in Chicago, 10% went into foreclosure between 2008 and 12. 10% of the houses, I believe, was so, and that there were something like 33,000 vacant homes in Chicago in 2013. So I mean, we're just looking at a crisis of just the highest proportions, and the people who are still living in those communities are the people we're talking about now.
Yeah.
And we're saying, well, if you just paid for your city sticker, right?
Yeah. No, that point about wealth building and the 2007-2008 crisis is so important, because it's not like we saw very slight closings of the wealth gap, the black-white wealth gap, the Hispanic-white wealth gap before 2007, 2008. Yeah. And 2007, 2008 blew it right back open again because of this disproportionate targeting of black neighborhoods that had been starved of mortgage dollars for decades, and now flooded with bad mortgage dollars,
subprime garbage,
with subprime loans and so on, that then whatever equity folks had developed in their had in their homes, you know, that's where some of these predatory lenders were looking. People who own their homes, and then they were looking for, you know, to pull some money out to do some repairs or to pay for somebody to go to college or something along those lines with very bad terms, and then they lose it and they lose all the equity. And that really has increased the wealth gap between blacks and whites across the country.
So it's not too difficult to draw a parallel between these disgraceful subprime mortgage selling banks and I don't know what you want to call them, but we'll just leave that alone for the time being, and certain municipalities that shall go unnamed that are essentially doing the same kind of financial shenanigans.
Yeah.
I mean, they're doing something very similar.
Yeah, I mean, I think both are extractive, right? I mean, both are extracting is capital from poor communities. And in Chicago, those poor communities happen to be Black and Latinx communities. And it's ironic because at the same time, Chicago will, elected officials in Chicago will kind of lament the exodus, the Black exodus from the city. We're losing population. No city wants the stigma of population loss or a declining city. But yet we haven't been thus far willing to kind of be critical in terms of why are people leaving? They can't afford to stay in the city. It's not just an issue of gentrification, which we do talk about, and that is an issue. But it's an issue of these punitive policies that make it impossible to keep a job or to keep a home. It makes it impossible because of this vicious cycle. And when you think about gentrification, people will move from neighborhood to neighborhood to find a kind of a more affordable living. They leave the city when the city policies, or they leave the state when state policies make it impossible to stay. That's what's happening.
Governor Rauner used to say that Illinois was losing population because everybody was just so upset with taxes and that they just had to escape to Indiana where things were going to be a lot better or something like that. I think a more realistic thing is to say that a factor in the massive loss of African American population from Chicago is because of punitive taxes that affect only them. So, if you are in this situation where you've just suddenly run up $1,200 or $12,000 in fines, you lost your car, you had to you're going to say, well, if I move just across the city boundary into one of these South Cook suburbs, I'm going to be free of that.
Yeah.
And that goes along with the reporting around that people in low-income black neighborhoods were paying disproportionate amounts in property taxes.
Yes.
The
right.
things that kind of moved us
Right.
to have
Right.
a new Cook County assessor. That's
Absolutely
another
right.
area where you see those disparities. And I want to add another word. So extractive is exactly the right word. And I would also add extortionary, because what does extortion mean? Extortion means pay under the threat of force. And when you go into many courts across the state, and you listen to people who come month after month and still have $20 to pay on their fine or $40 to pay on their fine, ultimately the state's attorney can issue what's called a petition to revoke their probation because they haven't paid what they owe in time. And the judge and the state's attorney can threaten them with jail time. Now, in order to put somebody in jail for not paying their fines, you're supposed to have a hearing to see if they willfully didn't pay, intentionally didn't pay. But in many of the courts that we've observed, there's a threat without saying, well, we first have to have this hearing. What people hear is, they're going to put me in jail right now if I don't pay. But really, the courts know, the judge knows, the state's attorneys know, they can't do it right then and there. They would have to have a hearing. But nonetheless, that threat is enough for people to, it's not like they had $20 in their back pocket and they just decided I wasn't going to pay. But they'll pay that $20 that they were going to spend on getting their bus pass for the next week, or buying, a child something, school supplies for the next week. So that kind of threat, paying under the threat of force, is the other EX word, extractive and extortionary.
That's right.
The population of Chicago's public housing, this would appear not to be related, but I think it's very much related. Population of the census of public housing in the 1970s was about 137,000. It's down to 23,000 now. Again, there are plenty of people in Chicago who would say, well, that's a victory. That's a total straight out victory. We don't have these horrible high rises filled with poor people anymore. I see a connection between that and the stuff we're talking about here today, but maybe I'm just a conspiracy theorist. I don't know.
No, not at all. No, I think there's surely a connection. It's a connection. Well, I mean, it's multifold in the sense that, and Mary can surely speak to this in terms of, you've been here a long time in terms of studying Chicago. But the way I understand it is, well, we no longer have public housing. We no longer have the number of folks in public housing or the number of units. We still have a lot of poor people, and people that used to live in public housing, they're forced to make their way in market rate or some kind of subsidized housing, right? But their fortunes did not just change dramatically, and they went from poor to kind of wealthy people, right? So these are the people that are vulnerable in the communities that we're talking about, and then their housing becomes vulnerable as well, because they're burdened with different types of debt, whether it's from the courts or through the fines and fees through the tickets. And that then puts a burden on their security of their housing, right? Because they don't live in public housing. And so it becomes this huge vicious cycle. And this notion that we're better off by not having public housing, I think that's a debate that will take another 40 minutes. But surely we need, I'm a strong advocate of public housing and good quality public housing, which it can exist.
Well, I mean, if you look at the history of public housing and I would say the good people who sort of birthed it, that was their notion, was that all these folks need is a leg up, right? We need to give them, if we can give them some good, safe, clean, if not deluxe public housing, then their aspirations will be to move on to something else. Somehow or other, that all got corrupted in Chicago, as so many things do. And
yeah, I think also from the perspective of city planners, city bureaucrats, I'm not so the best resident from their perspective is a middle class and up resident. That resident will pay higher taxes, will pay more in sales tax because they will consume more, will cost less in the way of social services and so on. And so I think what we're seeing, which is what we see in cities across the country, is that bureaucrats plan for that population, plan to attract that population, and they're doing a really good job. That population is disproportionately white. It is what contributes to the growth in the population in the few places where it is growing, downtown, the near west side, the near north side, and up the north lakefront. And those populations are growing. The white population has grown over that period as well. To lose poor residents is not, while you're right, no city wants to have population loss. And I think this is something, and I think this is a place where we would have leverage as kind of advocates in this regard. You know, Chicago never wants to be in a meeting with the Council of Mayors where we're losing population, and New York and LA and Houston is breathing down our throats to be the third largest city in the country. No mayor wants to be you kind of lord over that. So I think that's where we have some leverage. But the losing of poor people, many mayors would be like, okay, that's something off my balance sheet that was a cost, and I want to put an expense and put on my balance sheet some revenue.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
Yeah, that's why that's where the Sterling Bays of the world come in.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So let's try to conclude, if we can, with if there are any sorts of solutions that we might be able to think of here. There's been a lot of debate about rent control, and I know you've both spoken about it. Could it play any role in Chicago?
Well, I actually want to talk about a solution that is much more squarely on this issue of fines and fees and the costs and so on. So the Chicago Appleseed, the Chicago Lawyers Committee, the Shriver Center, those advocates, along with a lot of grassroots organizations, worked to get passed in Springfield a new law called the Criminal and Traffic Assessments Act. It is law. It will go into effect in July, and its biggest, the thing that it will do, it is graduated fee waivers for people who get on the, you can do the fines part, not the fees part, unfortunately, but on the fines, if you make under the federal poverty line, you will have your fines waived. You can have your fines waived. You can apply to have your fines waived.
Wait a minute, haven't you just buried the lead here? Shouldn't we have put this up at the top of the show?
Oh, well.
I didn't know this.
Yes, the Criminal and Traffic Assessments Act. So this is statewide. This is not the red light cameras, because that's municipal. This is the DUIs, the driving on a suspended license, up to robberies, felonies, so on and so forth.
All right.
So if you have a $750 fine for a DUI and you make under the poverty line, you can apply to have your fine waived. It's not the end-all be-all, and the organizations are still working on a number of things. It's not retroactive, for example. So if you're already in the system, whatever you owe, you owe. You still have to be proactive and apply for it. You have 30 days after your sentence to apply for it. So if you don't know about it, you won't apply for it, and then you still have to pay. It's only for the fines. As I mentioned, everything you owe are fines plus fees and costs. You have to pay $12 a month to be on probation. You have to pay all that stuff, you still have to pay. So there's still more room, and the advocates are still working on some of these other things. But in the area of the fines, if you make under the poverty line, you can apply to have them waived. If you make up to 200% of the poverty line, there are graduated waivers going for people up to 200% of the poverty line.
But for the record, that does not affect the person who gets a ticket in Chicago for not having a city sticker.
But there is a
not
conversation.
having a city sticker.
Yeah, there is a
Exactly right.
conversation. I think advocates are looking to do some form of more progressive tax, some kind of graduated policy whereby people pay based on their ability to pay, right? How they're going to determine that, I don't think it's been fully worked out, but there's legislation that folks are kind of trying to advocate for.
I mean, I read also that, one of these things, if you get your car impounded, you have 15 days to request a hearing. But nobody knows that, so half the people don't even do that.
That is so important,
That's
right? So information is so important. That's why I mentioned this new act, because getting the information out there, and part of it will be they need, the law says that the courts are supposed to post signs, and we're going to be working with the public defender's office and the probation office and so on so that people know about this on the court side.
I think that is the like for me the most important thing, the public awareness. How much do people understand? Do they understand? I mean, people feel pressure to file bankruptcy so that they don't lose their job and lose their license, but they're filing bankruptcy for Chapter 13. It doesn't mean that they're able to kind of pay off their debt. People just don't know. You know, they're doing things that they think is in the best interest, but they don't know, have full information.
And you know, this neoliberalism thing that you raised at the beginning is the thing that I find most galling, because so much of this is privatized. And when you hear the just the horror stories about what happens at the car pound, where, you know, you can have a car that's worth $5,000 and it just gets crushed, or even worse, the private contractor can sell it on the open market, and you don't get any of that money.
Yeah.
They get it.
Right.
Okay, well, I'm still just as worked up as I was in the beginning. You haven't calmed me down at all. Thanks a lot, both of you. I really enjoyed talking with you about this. This is such an important issue, and we have to keep it in the public eye at all times, because I think one of the key things to me is that I don't know about this, but I have a sense that a lot of people who are going through this think that they're going through it alone, that they don't really understand the massive nature of this really assault that's being done on them by their own government. And that's why it's really important to try to keep the word going out there.
I agree.
Yeah, definitely.
And also, I also had a little fantasy last night that if we really wanted to see this stuff ended, what you would do is you would tell the police to start impounding vehicles up in Edison Park for people playing their music too loud.
Yeah, deftly.
About 10 of those, and it would be over.
Yeah.
Just like that.
Yeah.
That's how you solve this problem. I'm always willing to help out. Thank you. Solution. Thank you so much for being here. Mary Patillo from Northwestern University, I really enjoy. I was watching some of your videos last night about Malia. That was really interesting.
Oh, right. That was at UIC also. I gave a talk.
About gentrification and how Barack Obama said.
I didn't mention Malia.
Right.
Obama mentioned Malia.
Right. That's right. Obama said, you know, this gentrification that's going on in South Shore, I don't have to worry about that. You know, only Malia's kids. And then you said to a great laughter, Malia's kids will never have to worry about it.
Right.
It's the others.
Yeah.
So because it never ends. Oh, and also Stacey Sutton. Let's not forget Stacey Sutton from UIC sitting there. And by the way, you also did some really interesting stuff about in New York City, about like 7-Elevens moving in and taking over bodegas and stuff. I was just in New York a little while ago, and I've been there a lot, and every time I go, I think it just seems to me there's fewer and fewer of these wonderful little stores, and you just documented it. So it's all on YouTube. Just look up Stacey Sutton, you'll see her. Assistant Professor of Urban Planning and Policy at UIC, and also Mary Patillo is a Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Northwestern University, and we thank them very much for both being here. You're watching Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. Don't forget you can go to this address to see any of our past shows, and many of them talk about these very issues, so it's kind of interesting to do. And we'll see you next time here on Chicago Newsroom. Thanks to Dave Resnick for producing, and to the whole crew for getting all this stuff together every week. Thanks much. See you next time. Bye.